My name is Yehoshua Pfeffer, and welcome to Yeshiva Shel Maila and to the Headline Show, which I'm hosting this week in place of Rav Dovid. So in today's program, we'll be addressing an issue which is directly relevant to many of us, and I think it touches indirectly all of us probably, and this is the relationship between the field of psychology, psychotherapy in all its different varieties, and Torah from Judaism. To what degree are the two in tension? To what degree can they go together? What are the significant issues in this important and ongoing discussion? So we know that in recent years, and I think generally this is certainly a blessing, so we've seen a far greater readiness in the frum world, in the Haredi world, Hasidic world even, both in the US and in Israel, to look in the eye of the harsh realities of mental or psychological health issues, issues that really plague many families and many individuals. And rather than being swept under a difficult carpet, a carpet of silence that often accentuates the difficulties and the problems, so people today are really turning often to professional help for all kinds of cases, whether it's depression or eating disorders of one type or another, or obsessive and compulsive behavior, even sexual deviance, abuse, chas v'shalom, and so on. And together with this trend, there's also been a great influx in the number of frum and Haredi professionals in the psychological fields. If in the past we've seen the Haredi space being known for perhaps a lack of professionalism, you know, anybody could do a kind of 3-month course and then become a therapist and start treating clients. So today there's really a tendency towards far greater professionalism, towards academic training, towards maintaining the kind of standards that are more or less accepted in the general modern society. And this, of course, presents the issue in a much more straightforward way. There's a Torah of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in Yehudah Chelik Beit, Siman Nun Zayin. So Rabbi Moshe writes about going to psychologists, but his question really relates. He speaks about psychologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, and psychiatrists that are minim and koifrim, people who don't believe and who don't practice Torah Judaism. And he writes that one shouldn't go. But one shouldn't go to them. He writes that they give eitzos and machshavos. They tell people how to behave, and he says sometimes they'll advise people neged dinei Torah, against dinei Torah, neged ikari hadas, against the basic fundamental principles of Yiddishkeit. So nowadays we don't have that concern as much because there's really a wide range of firm professionals active in the field. But the question that we want to deal with today is what kind of professional assistance is really appropriate for the firm or for Haredi society. We know in the past that several leading Rabbanim were very vocal in their opposition to any kind of psychological treatment. Rav Moshe Sternberg, for example, in Tzuvat Van Hages, Chelik Aleph, this is going back about 30 years, and he writes that psychologists see psychological treatment, and they present it, I quote, he writes, Royem ki refuah la'atzavim lasis l'chol echad taivis liboi lemaloisei v'lo l'agdulei karoi. He writes, psychologists tend to allow a person to feel good about themselves, even feel good about your taivis, feel good about your flaws in a moral or in a halachic sense. And he writes, v'lo misrape rak moisif u'machme matzavei him lichamoisam shelal. So he's very strongly against psychologists. Even Rav Shlomo Valbi, he was no stranger to psychology. Rav Valbi, Zechrono Livracha, studied psychology in Berlin at the beginning towards a degree. He didn't complete it, but he was certainly well versed in the discipline. He was well read, and he wrote in a letter. It's published in Igros Uksavim, and he writes that after giving the matter much thought, he concluded that we should distance psychology to the degree possible from our community. He writes, I reached a conclusion, we should distance the feet of psychology to the degree possible. So that's on the one hand, but On the other hand, we also know of many Rabbanim, many Mashgichim, Rosh Yeshiva, who willingly send to those Talmidim or those individuals who seek their counsel and advice, to send them to receive psychological treatment. Certainly there's a growing acceptance of the profession within the community, both in an institutional sense and in a private, in a personal sense. So this is the issue that we're going to discuss today. Is there really a deep tension between psychology and between Torah Judaism? Or should we really see the psychological field much like we see the medical profession, which is considered fairly value neutral? It's true that in Chatam Sofer and Shuvah, he writes famously that Yidden shouldn't rely on medical research performed on non-Jews. But of course, that's not a minute. We all rely on medical advances of the modern world and on research that's performed by the general medical community. So perhaps the same should be true of psychology. Are there really values that are imbued in modern psychology that run contrary to Torah living? Do frum psychologists just provide the essential service of healing for those suffering from psychological illnesses? Of course, they also provide a cultural sensitivity. That there have been many academic articles. I've seen a few articles written specifically about the Haredi world, the ultra-Orthodox world, about the kind of cultural sensitivity that's required, and that's what the frum psychologists can provide. Or do they in some way carry foreign values that enter our world via the back door of psychological treatment? So these are the questions we'll be discussing. We'll have three very distinguished guests today. We'll have Rabbi Dr. Avidan Milevsky. Dr. Milevsky is a professor of psychology at Ariel University here in Israel. He's also the author of several books in the field, especially about sibling relationships, about teenagers, and he's also an experienced therapist himself. We'll be hosting Rabbi Yehudah Herskovitz. He's a Torah editor, a longtime therapist dealing with psychological illness, and he recently penned a very important, certainly in recent years, article in a journal, in the Tzarech Ian Journal. I'm also the editor of the journal, so I know the article very well, on the subject of Torah and psychology. So he'll be presenting his view on the subject, and we'll be hosting Dr. Dovid Lieberman. Dr. Lieberman doesn't need any introduction. He's a renowned speaker, an award-winning author of many books, some of them bestsellers on the New York Times list, on the subject of psychology, the subject of how Torah ideas can also offer piercing psychological insights. So before we begin our fascinating and I think extremely important, crucial even conversation on this subject, let's first have this week's riddles. So this week we're going to be reading Parshas Bereshis, and on the pasuk command instructs Adam and Chava later in the mitzvah. The first mitzvah of the Torah is the mitzvah of Pruvu umilu es haaretz. And very interesting, the Rambam, we know Ben Azai refrained from getting married because nafshay Hashkafah Torah. And the Rambam paskins this. Very interesting. The Rambam in Hilchos Ishus writes, Misha Chashka nafshay b'Torah tamid. Somebody who desires Torah the whole time, exclusively. Ben Azai, and therefore he didn't get married because of he cleaved to Torah all of his days and therefore didn't get married. Says the Rambam, Ein b'yadai avay. He doesn't have a chait. And I mean, how can you be mevatel a mitzvah asay? Right, the very first mitzvah asay deraisa, the mitzvah of populating the world, of allowing the Tzura Adam, the form of man, to populate the world and to bring the elevation that only humanity can bring to the world, to bring in the Amzu Yatzartili Tilasi Saperu. How can a person refrain from this most elemental, basic mitzvah because of Talmud Torah? We know that Kol Mitzvah Sheva Torah, Talmud Torah is not Deicha. You can't. It's a mitzvah that nobody else can bring your children into the world. So how can the Talmud Torah in this case defer, as it were, the mitzvah of Pru'uvu? Have a look in Arachain Simon Ph.D. For a clue about that. But that's the first riddle for today. And the second riddle relates to the Chet of Adam Rishon. We know that Chava, when she was asked about, by the Nachash, when she was asked about the prohibition, then she said, she added that we mustn't touch the Pri Ha'etz. And Rashi said that she was Meisif, as it were, that the Baal Tosef here, she added, or Adam Rishon added, to the tzivui against eating from the Eitz Das, and they added another tzivui of not touching it. And the question is, what's wrong? What's the chait of adding on the tzivui not to touch the food? We know that there's a mitzvah of making a siyag l'Torah. The Mishnah Avos tells us a basic requirement of Chachamim is to make a siyag l'Torah. And in fact, in Avos Rebbe Nosson, Perek Aleph, on the words also siyag l'Torah, the Avos Rebbe Nosson mentions kederech she'adam harishon also, just like Adam Harishon did, that he made a siyag l'Torah, not only not to eat the fruit, but even not to touch it. Meaning he, like the Medrash says, Shirata lishmar et atmei ve'eschava mina et afilu b'negia. So it's mashma that he did a positive thing. So how does Rashi, based on the Gemara and Sanhedrin, say that this was an integral part of the chait of Adam Rishon, when l'chera it seems to be that this was a positive action of adding a siyag, adding a safeguard to the Torah mitzvah. So these are the two riddles for this week. And with that, we're going to move on to our conversation. The topic today, psychology and Torah Judaism. So our first guest on the show today is Rabbi Yehudah Herskovitz. Rabbi Herskovitz is a Torah editor with many years of experience and recently penned a long and very thorough essay in the Tzarech Ion Journal that really took apart some of the most basic questions of the relationship between Torah and psychology and psychotherapy. And the article was I wouldn't say scathing, but it certainly made some very serious points and perhaps you could say accusations concerning the psychology profession, and sparked vigorous discussions with reactions from across the pale. So this is, I think, a good time to be bringing up the subject with you, Rav Yehudah. Thank you very much for being with us on the show today.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me.
So let me start off with a very general question, and that is, what would you say is the most basic tension? I understand that from your article it's very clear that you believe there is a very deep tension between psychology as a discipline and Torah Judaism. How would you describe the most basic element, the most basic feature of that tension, contradiction even, correct me if you think otherwise, between Torah on the one hand and psychology as a discipline on the other?
Well, psychology is presented by some as an objective discipline and as being a neutral discipline. I think that this is incorrect. Psychology emerges from a very particular worldview, psychology as it is practiced today, and psychology as it is practiced in any era, whether in ancient times, whether in the early modern period, was always predicated on some sort of worldview. And this is as true today as it was in previous times. And that worldview, in many ways, contradicts and is the antithesis of Torah Judaism. That is my claim. The set of values upon which psychology is based upon is really the set of values where psychology is being taught, which is in academia. And academia is an institution which has a very specific worldview. They are not embarrassed about admitting to it. They have a universalist worldview. They have a worldview that's based on mankind is all of mankind is equal. They blur any differences between any sorts of social standings whatsoever. There are no differences between male and female, ruler and ruled, different classes of people, and so on and so forth. Maybe these are wonderful values, but they are not necessarily the values that are found in Torah Judaism. Torah Judaism has a different set of values. And so the claim that psychology is neutral as far as it pertains to values is simply not just incorrect, it's impossible. You cannot be educated in an institution which has a very firm set of beliefs and emerge from that institution with the same set of beliefs that you entered it. You will be influenced by what you hear around you. There's no way you can avoid that. You are human. You being the generic you, referring to people who study psychology in academia. So therefore, you're always going to be influenced by values that are antithetical to Torah values, whether you like it or not, whether you're conscious of it or not. There's nothing you can do about it.
So I'll return to the values soon in due course, but just before we get there, just allow me to perhaps challenge that from the medical discipline. Meaning, if we look at the medical profession, that's also studied, at least nominally, in academia, in academic institutions. But certainly we would all rely on medical research, on medical progress for our well-being, for our healing. Don't you think that would or might be a valid comparison? Meaning, psychologists would say that our discipline is also, at least it's moved on to being similar to the medical profession in the sense that it's based on valid scientific research, and therefore these claims of, well, it's all based on values, modern values or academic values, or some values aren't legitimate claims, not today.
Well, the disciplines being studied in university are really on a spectrum. So you're going to have some which are going to be more affected by the worldview and some which are going to be less affected. For example, mathematics would probably be very little affected by the worldview, even though mathematics, some would claim, is also affected by the worldview. That's in the study of infinity, whether it's a legitimate field of study or not. But let's avoid that question. What I'm saying is that there are fields which are more influenced by subjective criteria and fields which are less influenced. So medicine is easier to verify than psychology. Medicine, if somebody's got an illness, you can actually objectively measure whether his blood count, how high is his blood count. You can't get around that number. White cells, and so on and so on and so forth. If somebody's got a growth in the body, you can actually measure the size of the growth. So there are objective standards for measuring whether a person is well or unwell. In psychology, there are very, very few ways of measuring objectively, and those measures themselves are open to a great deal of interpretation. Everything is far more fluid, and as such, because the standards are not fixed, therefore there is much more room for subjective points of view to enter the field.
So really, you're making a statement really placing the whole field of psychological research into question. And you're saying that their standards of research, their methodology, is just not up to standard in terms of objective measurement, and rather is concealing or hiding a bias which is contingent on worldview, on values, and a value system which is in opposition to Torah values.
Yes, and I'm saying that. I'm saying altogether the study of statistics is an extremely difficult field. One would believe when one begins to study statistics that you can actually study real-life questions and emerge with very clear answers. This is really not true in any field, even in medicine. Statistics do not lend themselves to an easy interpretation. So in some fields, you're going to get more clear answer with this use of statistics. In other fields, like psychology, statistics is virtually useless. They are just a reflection of the bias of the researcher, for the most part. Sure, there are some statistical studies that are valid, but we have no way of knowing which ones are valid and which ones are invalid. The field is just far too fluid, too many open questions, too easy to manipulate, too easy to interpret in many different ways, too open to biases. They're very vulnerable to what people want to think. And so take all that into account, the study of statistics as applied to psychology is a very questionable effort.
Right, but if we bring things down to earth, you have somebody who is suffering from clinical depression, who's not getting out of bed. You have somebody who's suffering from a severe eating disorder and isn't eating in ways far beyond what he or she should be weighing. You have people who have a compulsion or obsessive compulsive disorders and do Netilas Yadayim 20 times before they eat. You have people with real disorders, and these disorders seem to be across the board, meaning, we have them in our Frum community, they occur in non-Frum community, they occur in non-Jewish, just as much as they do in other places. And then the question would be, well, if we found an effective way of overcoming these disorders, then shouldn't those ways, which, I imagine that the effectiveness can be tested at least to some degree, why shouldn't we apply those methodologies and those forms of therapy in our own, from community, of whether it's the same problem of clinical depression or whether it's a slightly different expression of it, like somebody who's saying Kriya Shema 20 times or doing the Netilas Yadayim 20 times?
Well, again, that is exactly the question that we're trying to answer, which is, if theoretically, let's say we know that there is a psychologist who studied only in academia, and he had this brilliant solution to anorexia, let's say. Well, yes, of course you should go to him. If he's got the solution, then yes, march a path to his door. That's not the issue at all. The issue is questioning whether these psychology actually provides solutions. And when you look at the numbers are very disappointing. As I wrote in the article, for every 6 people who go to a psychologist, 3 are going to emerge unscathed, unchanged. 1 is going to be to change for the worse, and 2 are going to change for the better. So you have here a success rate of about 35%, a damage rate of about 15%, and a no impact rate of about 50%. Those are
depending, of course, on the types of problems.
On the types of problems, sort of, yes.
Types of disorders that we're speaking about.
Well, some disorders are absolutely beyond hope, for the most part, such as, let's say, borderline personality disorder, which is a very difficult disorder to overcome. But, yes, so there are more serious disorders and there are less serious disorders. But overall, across the board, we have a very, very low success rate. We have about 35% success rate, which means that if you would have a leak in your kitchen sink, and I would tell you, call a plumber who has a 35% success rate and a 15% rate of making your leak worse, you'd look at me as if I were crazy. Why would he call such a plumber? You'd have to, even if there was no way of fixing the problem, you would try everything else before calling a plumber. And I'm saying the same thing about psychology. The success rate is very low and very disappointing. It does not provide the answers which it tries to provide. And therefore, the whole effort is questionable.
Well, the question is the kind of alternative. What would you suggest as an alternative to the psychology discipline, which is certainly trying, at the very least, to get to the bottom, trying to provide solutions, trying to provide effective treatment, and trying to put in the relevant research? Whether there are different opinions. I'm aware of different opinions as to the efficacy of the research, and you're quoting one study perhaps. But the question would be, if you puzzle, if you decide to not go with a psychological profession, then you seem to be playing into the hands of so-called therapists who often have 3-month training course or something, and they can call themselves psychoanalysts or psychotherapists of some variety. Isn't this far more dangerous than at least having a measurable or tested in some way, supervised professional field Second, provide certain standards of treatment with certain levels of effectiveness.
Well, let's put your question in perspective. Your question is, how do we provide effective treatment? Well, that is the $64 billion question, which every single therapist who enters the field altruistically is trying to answer. And that was a question that I tried to answer when I sort of entered the field. And I read up widely. And again, my question was, when we are surrounded by a lot of suffering, and a lot of times you want to reach out and help. How do you help somebody overcome his challenges, overcome his pain? That is a question that we're trying to answer. And now the psychologists, the ones that are studying academia, come and say, we have the answer to this question. You come to us.
Allow me to paraphrase them just for their benefit. We have again, the more perhaps modest ones would say, we have a reasonable working theory to answer this question based on many years of experience, based on many years of research, based on many years of study, and based on many years of experimentation. So at least we have a reasonable chance, meaning at least we have a reasonable
let's say they would say we are the best bet. Let's say we are your best target.
We're best equipped. Yeah,
we're the best equipped. I think that's a fair characterization of what many decent psychologists would say. However, the evidence on the ground just doesn't back them up. We have not seen that psychologists, once we have the basic conditions, let's say we have a psychologist who's trained in a wonderful institution, and we have somebody who started off on his own, and we have the same conditions. You go to these two people for the same amount of time, for the same length of time every week for a couple of months, and then we compare the results. You will not see a major difference between the results between somebody who did study in academia and somebody who did not study in academia. Those differences are not there. They're just not there when we search for them. That means as long as we have some basic conditions, which are a desire to help yourself, number one, which is the most important desire, which many people who are unwell do not have that desire or do not believe that. But let's say we have that. We have that desire to get better, and we develop a good connection with our psychologist. And the psychologist imbues the client with the belief that he is going to get better, right? Then everything else just is irrelevant. That means the academic study of psychology does not ultimately equip you to become a better therapist. It just doesn't.
Well, this is an empirical question. I'm sure that different studies will provide us with different
there are meta-studies. There are meta-studies which are studies of studies.
Right, but more interesting, meaning this is very interesting and it's obviously very important. But your point, though, it goes beyond that. Your point would state that going to a psychologist who studied in academia and is imbued by academic and secular values is also something which is deeply damaging to the Jewish person, or to the frum person, to the person.
I would not make that blanket statement, because there are plenty of decent, humane, frum psychologists who study in academia and do their level best. So I wouldn't condemn them all out of hand. I would say, however, that this is something that needs to be looked into. And if you're going to go to a psychologist who has internalized and absorbed those secular values, then yes, if you're from a frum community, that psychologist is ultimately going to cause more damage than help. But there are many psychologists who, despite having gone to academic institutions, reflect very much traditional Jewish values. So I would not condemn them all out of hand. What I am saying is that just like a doctor, if somebody has a certain serious disease, he's going to look for the best doctor. So somebody has a serious psychological problem has to look for the best psychologist. And the fact that somebody went to university does not necessarily make him a better psychologist than somebody who has a deep and profound understanding of the human psyche and works with people and actually cares about them and wants them to get better.
But let me try to thrash this out a bit
Sure.
more. Sure. A person has a disorder. He's not getting out of bed. He's suffering from depression or from an eating disorder. He needs to gain human functionality. In that sense, what room is there really for the discussion of values, of academia, and so on? The guy needs to get out of bed. So he should surely go to whoever's got the best, track record, whether he's a Jewish or non-Jewish or studied here, studied there, whoever's going to get him to become a functional human being in the way that he's currently suffering from and not functioning properly. That's what he should do. Is there really room for this kind of value-oriented discussion here?
I absolutely agree that if you know of somebody or if somebody knows of somebody who can get people out of bed, yes, well, of course, he's making a better mousetrap. People should be going to him. There's no question about that at all. My criticism or my question is, let's say we have two psychologists, one with academic credentials and one without academic credentials, and we don't know which of them is better. Then my argument is that all factors being equal, I would not know that the one who has academic credentials is better than the one who does not have academic credentials. I wouldn't make that statement.
But elaborate on the danger of the person that's being tracked. Let's not speak about the firm practitioner that you want to give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's speak about just the average practitioner, the average psychologist who studied in academia and certainly adopted the value set. How is that? In which sense are those values contradictory to Torah? Or you know what? Let me put it the other way. In which sense does a Torah Jew, somebody that's imbued with Torah values, how does that give a person an advantage in being a practitioner or a therapist of some sort? Is there an advantage to being a Talmid Chacham, let's say, or somebody imbued by Torah values? Does that give a person an advantage in his psychological, for want of a better word, practice in treating people?
Since I believe, and I'm sure that those non-Jews perhaps would not believe the same as I do, but since I believe that being Jewish is holistically better for me on all dimensions, on physical dimension, spiritual dimension, emotional dimension, mental dimensions, and so on and so forth, that means being Jewish is actually a positive way of living, then yes, somebody who has internalized those Jewish values will be better equipped to advise somebody how to live a meaningful, good, healthy, satisfying life than somebody who has internalized values which do not necessarily lead to a better lifestyle. Yes.
Meaning you wouldn't divide this into like two layers. There's a first layer of let's get the guy out of bed. There's a second layer of let's help him in keeping Torah and mitzvahs in a way which he's content with and in a way that gives him fulfillment. You would say it's all one question. Being a functional person for a Jewish person means being a functioning Jew.
Let's talk about getting a guy out of bed. Let's say somebody comes to a psychologist and he's sleeping 16 hours a day, and that's without knowing too much about the fellow, you can assume offhand that there's some sort of depression going on over here, and so you want him to heal, to start being able to actually get out of bed. So now the standard approach would be to talk to this, to that, to the other. How did you get here? Why did this happen? Why did et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there is research which shows that actually 15 minutes of exercise per day is pretty effective for getting somebody out of bed. It's getting somebody out of depression. So if somebody comes to a therapist and he's in bed for 16 hours a day, the therapist would be well advised to take a walk with him for 15 minutes or 30 minutes, because the actual physical exercise would help the fellow get out of the rut. Now, this idea which I'm mentioning is something actually which was found by secular psychologists. This is not something that intuitively you would guess, but it does seem to be well-based, that physical exercise can help somebody get out of depression. So a secular psychologist who happens to have this piece of information would probably be better placed to help somebody than a from psychologists does not have this piece of information. But once both of them have this piece of information, which is a very small piece of information, but once both of them are aware of this information, then perhaps the from psychologist would be better placed to help him continue to grow, to help him continue to heal, and so on and so forth. So I'm absolutely in agreement that secular psychology has a lot to offer in specific areas, specific ideas, especially in the field of trauma, of post-traumatic stress disorder, of obsessive-compulsive disorder, and so on and so forth. They do have good ideas. There are very good ideas out there. But you don't need to go to academia to find out those ideas. All you need to do is read a little bit here, a little bit there, and you've got them all at your fingertips. It's very easy to find them. But since a major part of psychological healing is the personal relationship that you create with your therapist, and since that personal relationship will define your healing, then yes, it would be better for a frum fellow to go to a frum therapist who he can create a better connection with, who better understands his background, who better understands his goals, who better understands what is healthy for him, than to go to a secular psychologist who is informed by a different set of values.
Right. I mean, in the article, you do speak extensively about the different values. You speak about the question of morality that in Jewish practice is underlined, whereas it isn't in psychology. You speak about guilt. You speak about individualism. Do you think that just based on Torah, without studying, the psychological discipline, and I'm not speaking even about but both the theoretical side and the empirical side. Do you think that from Torah one could develop a holistic and an effective psychological approach based on those values that you speak about?
Well, to be a good psychologist, I think a person also needs to have a certain breadth of soul, a greatness of soul, which will enable them to understand the other from the other's point of view, not from his own point of view. Ayn Rand said that we don't understand things. We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. In order to be a good psychologist, one has to see things as they are and not as we are. The academic study of psychology does give one the tools to see things in a more broad-minded way. This is true. Again, this is something that modern-day psychology does contribute. Having said that, if you take somebody like the Stipler, he had an extraordinary understanding of the human psyche, and yes, he got it all from the Torah. So did the Chazon Ish, so did various other people, Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer, so did the Alter of Nevardok, so did many others. But these were truly, truly great individuals, and I don't think it is reasonable to expect that every mashgiach be on the level of Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer or the Stipler and so on and so forth. So unless the mashgiach is particularly insightful and particularly wise, then I think he would gain by studying some sort of secular psychological works which would provide insight, depending on which works and so on and so forth. So theoretically, if somebody is sitting and learning all his life and he really works on his soul and he's born already with a great soul, so yes, theoretically it is possible that he will achieve wonderful understanding. For a regular psychologist, I think there is what to be gained by being exposed to certain ideas, to certain works, to certain modes of thought, to certain questions, to certain approaches found in the secular field, yes.
Mm-hmm. And then the firm psychologist, his duty or his role would be to to take those tools or to take those ideas and to merge them with his own Torah experience, insofar as these two things are in opposition to one another. That seems to be a very, challenging, a significant challenge.
Let's take panic attacks.
Okay.
Now, panic attacks are generally an inability of the body to deal with the adrenaline, which is coursing through the veins, which is flowing through the veins. It's sort of like taking a car downhill with no brakes and no steering wheel. You're going 150 miles per hour with no opportunity to protect yourself. Everything is on overdrive. And so somebody comes to Mashgiach, and what do I do? Okay. So some Mashgiachim perhaps would say, let's say, you need to work on Emunah, you need to work on Bitachon, you need to work on this, you need to work on that, you need to work on the other. These might be effective ways of dealing with it. A psychologist, I think a Torah psychologist, might recommend the following. Go to a swimming pool and start swimming. Now, when you start swimming, when you start exercising, the adrenaline builds up. Go swimming up to a certain point where you can handle that adrenaline. You feel that you're starting to go downhill. You know, when I say you, I always mean the generic you, yes? And when you start going downhill, but enough that you've still got the brakes, control of the brakes and the steering wheel. And then do that for a couple of times, 2 or 3 times. And then the next week, do it again and go a little bit faster in the pool and exercise a little bit more, so there's a little bit more adrenaline flowing through the system, and you gain a little bit more control over the adrenaline rush, and so on and so forth, until a person can actually start dealing with this rush through adrenaline. Now, this idea that I had, I actually read a doctorate about a way of dealing with panic attacks by actually having a mask put on one's face and lowering the amount of oxygen that was reaching the person. And when a person is not breathing enough, they go into a panic. And so they would lower it just that point where he can actually breathe, but not that he's going into the panic. So he's getting control over the system. Now, these ideas are easy ideas, relatively speaking. They're not confrontational. They don't deal with values. They're not contradictory to Torah values, and so on and so forth. And so a person can actually make use of them. But if you're a mashgiach in yeshiva, you're going to need a very lot of insight in order to come up with this idea. But if you are exposed to the right literature, then you can be an effective Torah psychologist without having gone to academia.
But without the systematic, without the systematic learning that you get in academia, you never know what you'll be exposed to. Meaning, if you're going to be a didactic and a self-educated person, then unless you learn everything, again, academia gives you that system. It's a systematic way of study. It's difficult to emulate that outside the world of academia.
Again, the academic study of psychology is, in the main, a study based on a value system. If you can study those fields without being exposed to the value system, then you're doing very well for yourself. The academic study of psychology involves so many fields that are just not necessary. For example, the study of physiology, the study of statistics, which is a complete waste of time.
In your opinion, yeah.
I think let's put it this way.
Those who engage in the studies,
95% of psychologists will never look again at a statistical study once they have qualified as a psychologist. I would say that. I think that's a fair number. Or 90%. It's an absolute waste of time, which the majority of them forget completely. Okay. Statistics is a very hard field.
Most lawyers, most attorneys don't deal with constitutional law, but you still have to study.
But that's also a complete waste of time. I'm going to be the last who's going to actually defend the academic study of any discipline. I think a large majority of it is a complete and utter waste of time. Academia has a stranglehold on higher studies, and there's nothing you can do about it. But much of it is useless. But let's get back. But useless is half of the problem. The main problem is that it imbues one with a certain set of values which are contradictory to Torah values. But the person can. Anybody can take first year, second year, third year psychology course books in the university and read through them in a couple of weeks. It's not a big deal, and you can choose for yourself what you think is worth it and what you think is not worth it. You don't need to go to study it and have tests.
Well, again, you're leaving so much up to the individual discretion of But let me ask you the following. Recently, I think even in the Frum, even in the Haredi community in Eretz Israel, certainly in America. We're finding a much a much changed attitude towards psychology in general. Whereas, in the past, I think there was this very deep suspicion and a very, I would say, reticence of engaging in psychological professionals. I think today there's a trend that welcoming psychologists of different walks, whether it's on an institutional level, whether it's on a personal level. Do you see that as a blessing, or do you see that as something problematic?
I see that as very problematic. The fact that the public discourse has been taken over by men and women who do not have a major knowledge of Torah, but are, they went through the yeshiva system to some degree, they went through the seminary system to some degree, and then they go off to academia, and then they come back and they start educating all of us. I see that as a terrible problem, absolutely terrible.
Well, isn't the very awareness though of these disorders of various sorts? That at least you would concede is a positive. At least we're aware that it's a problem that needs to be dealt with, rather than sweeping them under the carpet. Surely that's a good place to start from.
No, I don't agree with that. It's a good place to start from. The whole question of what is considered a problem or what is not considered a problem is again a profound and difficult question. When we have somebody who walks into shops and he takes things without paying, is he a ganef or is he a kleptomaniac? That is a legitimate question. And psychologists have a very clear answer. He's a kleptomaniac. Torah system has a very clear answer too. He's a ganef. Those are two different answers, and with profound implications to the way we view that particular individual.
Well, again, you could see, why is this a contradiction? He's a ganef, but his gneva is possibly the result of a mental disorder that we can, you would say, well, if he's a ganef, then he's chayav, he's not chayav malchus, but let's say he's doing some other issa, he's chayav malchus, and the solution is to give him malchus. Well, perhaps he might be chayav malchus, but perhaps he can be helped to refrain from doing it again by means of psychological treatment that will engage the root of the problem, or at least one root of the problem in his kleptomania, rather than in his actual action. So wouldn't you say that it's not necessarily a contradiction?
You're working under the assumption that if we say he's a kleptomaniac, we're going to have this brilliant approach to actually healing him. But
that's the idea, isn't it? We're going to try.
We're going to try to deal with him. Okay. But that whole effort is questionable. Perhaps we cannot deal with him. Perhaps the correct way of dealing with him is telling him to his face, listen here, my friend, you're a ganef, you need to shape up. You don't need psychological help. You need a patch upon him. The patch upon him, what was certainly used to be a common methodology in schools and in homes. It's certainly out of fashion today. You would endorse going back to patch upon him kind of. 6 of the best in school. I think I would not condemn. No. I mean, obviously, if you're going to have one school which gives 6 of the best on a regular basis, and all other schools don't, then yes, the children are obviously going to feel completely done in and full of complaints, yes. But corporal punishment being taken out of school, I don't want to talk about cruel and evil and wicked corporal punishment, but I'm talking about reasonable corporal punishment, where the child was punished, didn't hurt him too much, but the lesson came through very clearly. I would not condemn as being completely out of hand. Again, we're talking about a complete set of values here, which may or may not be correct. I don't feel that it is up to the psychologists who are trained, who are professionally trained, to come back to the frum community and tell us how to behave. No, your set of values.
But one thing doesn't necessarily follow from the other. Revolver. It's well known that he wasn't a fan of psychology, but on the other hand, he was certainly not a fan of corporal punishment. He was very, strongly against.
I say again, I'm not here. I'm not worthy of deciding between Revolver and others who disagreed with him. That's not the point. The idea is, though, that not everything that psychologists say we have to accept. No, I'm sorry, and I'm completely unconvinced that they are actually contributing to the welfare of the community. The community today in modern times, I think is in considerably worse shape than it was, let's say, 40, 50, 60 years ago.
Some would argue that if they would have more psychological treatment, they might be in better shape. You would argue exactly the opposite. That it's because
I don't know what the reason is. I do know that that there are problems today in the community that make one's hair stand on end.
There are problems in across the, it's not just in
of course
unfortunately not. It filters even into our community, but these are universal.
Absolutely, and I don't know the reasons for that, but I would definitely not accept wholeheartedly that psychologists are here to save the day. I don't know. Maybe perhaps they're contributing to the problem. I don't know. I would definitely say that it's not their place to come and tell us what to do. What they can do is go to Choshev Rabbanim, go to Talmidei Chachamim, and I mean serious Talmidei Chachamim, and serious Yirei Shemayim, not whatever, and go to them and say, okay, we've studied in academia, we have the following ideas, we'd like to submit them to you for a discussion perhaps, or for a criticism perhaps. And then, after they've discussed it with various Rabbanim and come to a serious conclusion, then yes, we would be open to accepting their ideas. But that's not what happens. They come out of academia, and they're absolutely convinced that they're going to save the world, and they're going to teach the from community exactly what they need to do, how to behave and what to think and how to believe and how to relate to children and how to relate to off the derech kids and so on and so forth. And they're going and they're preaching all day and all night, telling us exactly what's wrong with us and how they didn't have just the right answers. I'm sorry. Why? Who are you? Where are you? Who do you think you are? I don't know that they're contributing at all. I wouldn't be surprised in the least to find out that they are a major part of the problem. If they're going to tell kids who are going off the derech, I mean, this we find in popular publications over and over and over and over again in 1,001 different ways, how the parents and the teachers are all to blame and the kid is always right. That absolutely destroys parental and teacher authority. I think that contributes to the problem. It's a major part of the problem when a child feels that he's always right and the teacher's always wrong. And that comes directly from the academic establishment.
Okay. I'm not sure if your academic peers would necessarily agree to that assumption about approaches, meaning this goes back to what you mentioned in the article also about guilt, about the approach of psychology being a non-guilt approach as opposed to the Torah approach.
Yes.
That would take us to get into too many nitty-gritties, I think. But Rabbi Herskovitz, thank you very much. Definitely, I think your words are provide a significant challenge and certainly a unique voice, which I think reflects what many Haredi people think in a kind of unconscious or less aware way, and kind of brings it out in a convincing and appealing way. I'm sure that the conversation is very important, and thank you very much for sharing the ideas with us.
Well, I hope I contributed something to the conversation, and thank you for having me on the show. I hope I hope the effort was worth it.
Thank you very much. Take care.
All the best. Bye-bye.
So our next guest on today's program is Dr. Dovid Lieberman. Dr. Lieberman, I'm sure for many listeners, doesn't need any introduction. He's a renowned speaker and award-winning author of many books on the subject of psychology and how Torah ideas can merge or can offer insights into psychological themes. Some of the books are New York Times bestsellers. Dr. Lieberman, thank you very much for being with us today.
It is my pleasure. Thank you.
Good. So let me just, bring you right into the debate and the discussion. And part of the discussion has really revolved around the question of the efficacy, whether psychological, whether the background that psychologists have, which is often academic background, whether that's essential for a psychologist to be an effective therapist. Meaning, many in the Haredi world are suspicious about people in general, and certainly psychologists who have studied in academia and perhaps absorbed non-Torah values and will prefer to go to a kind of internal yeshivish, kind of Hamish therapist who hasn't had this background, but he may be a very intelligent person and maybe he's done independent reading. How would you kind of pass that discussion of the professional psychologist who's done the full training, he's been 5 years, he's done he's done everything, versus the kind of less professional but perhaps very intelligent and competent guy within the community?
Right, good. So there's a lot of intricacies to that question, so I guess we'll just begin to sort of parse different layers. First is that just because somebody comes in with, an academic background and a license and a lot of education doesn't mean that he's competent. Forget about proper Hashkafah, doesn't mean that he's competent. At the same time, you could have somebody who is not formally schooled, that has a very good sense of people, very intuitive, and can be very, very effective at helping to move someone along. Having said that, there is what to say for being educated, being familiar, being skilled in certain types of methodologies. So that's just in terms of the competency. Beyond that, you certainly have, the issue of values and whether or not they are going to seep into the conversation or the therapeutic setting. And I do think that raises a legitimate red flag. It doesn't disqualify it altogether, certainly. And there's some types of therapies and some types of maladies that are largely irrelevant. If a person has, comes in with OCD or ADHD, something like that, while a therapist's own personal views may seep into the conversation, it's not going to be as significant as if a person is coming in with shalom bias issues or relationship problems or anxiety. That's when you want to make sure that you're speaking to somebody whose values are consistent with yours.
Mm-hmm. And broadly speaking, though, would you say that a firm practitioner, somebody who is trying his best to be loyal and he has a strong fidelity to Torah values, would you recommend that he would actually study the discipline in an academic environment, or does the academic environment itself somehow taint the very field and raise this kind of inherent tension that is hard to put together?
Right, very good question. It certainly depends on where you go. We have a number of good options now to get a proper education, in a good from environment. But you will find, though, in the mainstream schools, it borders on frightening what they pass off, by the way, as education, when really it's just repackaged ideology. And you're also going to find that if you speak to a therapist, for example, who removes the idea about a creator, a God, from the equation, fundamentally that therapy is going to fail because it doesn't, a person comes in there with an anger issue. I tell you something interesting. I came out with a book through a regular mainstream publisher a couple of months ago called Never Get Angry Again. And I had a ongoing disagreement with my publisher because I wanted to include the concept of God, a creator of the universe. And they didn't want that in this kind of book. They wanted strict psychology. And I said, if a person is reading a book on anger and they believe that they're the center of the universe and things don't go according to their expectations, of course they're going to find themselves angry. I said, you have to bring this into it. And I did. And so, it's the reason, by the way, is why a lot of the mentality to remove HaKadosh Baruch Hu, remove a creator from the scene, is because when a person goes into therapy and you've got issues of guilt and shame, the logic, as corrupted as it is that if there's no objective morality, if there is no God, no creator to tell me right from wrong, then it recuses the person of responsibility and obligations, and thus should eliminate any feelings of guilt. Obviously, it's a flawed system, because if you move out of reality, you become less healthy. But that is what they try to package as a effective form of therapy. In other words, don't feel guilty, because who says that you're a bad guy. Who says that you're wrong for doing X, Y, and Z?
Mm-hmm. Meaning that you would say that the orthodox position of psychologists or psychotherapists in general is very anthropocentric. It's moral, endorses kind of moral relativism, places the person in the center. That's
I may have misspoke or just understood your recap. My suggestion is that the non-orthodox, or rather,
I didn't mean Orthodox Jews. No, I didn't mean Orthodox Jews. I mean the orthodoxy of psychology.
Oh,
meaning the position that you'll learn about if you're studying psychology in a secular institution.
Yes, they will. Yes, they will. In broad strokes, remove any sort of reference. Interesting also, I mean, go look at the AA and the different types of anonymous programs, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. Way back when, the original tenets were to accept as the creator of the universe, and they've since abridged that in order to accommodate a more liberal mentality. So yes, it moves away from sort of any sort of power that is beyond us. Sometimes, they'll talk about the universe or about, Mother Nature, but they are moving further and further into a more, diluted version of reality.
Well, this is fascinating, though. I mean, the question would be then, and I'm sure you can lean on your personal experience in this, but as a general question, how does someone entering the discipline, how does he manage to filter through the kind of education that you need to have? You need to have the tools, and you need to have the methodologies and so on. And are they not really imbued by these kind of values? I mean, that's how they developed. That's how they came to the world. So how do you take them and then filter out those elements and make them effective from a perspective that you're being loyal to your core values?
Right. Well, so when you speak about psychology, it's a discipline that has many different branches. You've got therapies, CBT, EFT, REBT, EMDR. There are many methodologies that don't necessarily require a holistic or even humanistic approach. So, you've got a better chance at sort of, developing a skill set there. Once you broaden out psychology to, psychoanalysis and to Freudian psychology and to the other methodologies, it's going to incorporate areas that can be a little bit more tricky. So yes, it can be a bit of a minefield, and you have to go into it recognizing that just because it's in a textbook doesn't make it true.
And for example, so if you are dealing with a patient or client, and he's trying to, he's suffering from some kind of a psychological ailment. So for you, being coming from a Jewish or firm perspective, so guilt would not be taboo, meaning you would say, you can feel guilty, and even though that would probably run against the kind of, again, I use the word orthodoxy as in the psychologist orthodoxy, even though you're running against what's accepted in the psychological, let's say, community, you would have no problem with doing that based on your own convictions.
That's right, and this is where you could bring a Torah understanding into the therapeutic process, and guilt is a good example, because we do not, except for Bubby, believe in the concept of Jewish guilt. We believe in tshuva. Hashem does not want us to wrap ourselves up in this blanket of self-pity and guilt and beat ourselves up and not move forward. At the same time, he doesn't want us to
we have
abandon...
Harata is right, regret.
Regret, that's right. Hashem doesn't want us at the same time to abandon and recuse ourselves of responsibilities and obligations. So what does the Torah say about this? It says, look, we've got a process of tshuva. Go ahead and do it. Release yourself from the guilt and move forward. Whereas if, you did not have that understanding and you went to a psychologist without Torah values, he may either tell you that, why you're feeling guilty, everyone makes mistakes, move on with life, in which case, obviously, there's a gap in that approach. Or, he may offer you some sort of resolution that really isn't the proper steps of tshuva. Having said that, if you apply the tshuva process, but the person gets stuck, let's say they've done something, and I've spoken to a number of people, one just comes to mind, but I'm just not going to mention the details, and this guy is really mired in guilt, and he has a problem moving forward, so you can't simply say, just do tshuva. You really have to be able to understand what's going on emotionally in order to help nudge him and move him forward.
The question then would be, we know that there is a tradition of rabbinical authorities that have been, reluctant, perhaps is to put it mildly. Some have actually, come out quite vocally against going to psychologists, against going to therapy from professionally trained psychologists. You would actually identify to some degree with those warnings, but you would say that we can overcome that by having training in a correct or in a modified environment. Is that putting it accurately?
I think so. Look, you go back 10 years ago, there wouldn't be too many yeshivas that would welcome the opportunity to send, a buck or two a therapist. Now, it may be their very first phone call. And I don't think we really have the luxury of throwing the proverbial, baby out with the bathwater. There are legitimate concerns in going to some therapist for some things. That's unequivocal. It would be foolish to say otherwise. At the same time, if you have somebody who's legitimately suffering with an illness, with a disorder, I think it's irresponsible not to explore every possible option that can help to get this person well.
And perhaps, could you tell me something about these 10 years? What happened? Like, what actually caused this change from, not even thinking of picking up the phone to that being the first option? What happened in these 10 years?
Right. So it's a very good question. I would say is that as life has gotten, predictably easier, more comfortable, and we've become so much more self-focused. We've had, ironically, more time to reflect, more time to think. We're not so busy working, running for our lives, defending our values, and so we've really we've begun to manifest more, not just, we talk about, the quantity, but statistically speaking, there is a greater degree of emotional instability across all cultures, and we are not insulated from that. So when you have people suffering with anxiety, which is becoming much more pervasive, when you have people suffering with OCD, ADHD, and a number of these disorders, which can be very often helped by medication, which is something that we didn't discuss. It's irresponsible to have this person suffer. At the same time, of course, you don't want to be reckless in your approach and just go to anyone hanging out a shingle. But if somebody's suffering with a problem and you have not been able to, and here's the barometer. If you have an issue and it's interfering with the quality of your life or the quality of the life of people around you, you have to be responsible and explore all reasonable options. And you start with the ones that are least invasive, the most reasonable, and then you move forward from there.
Right, but it's, it seems to be, to some degree at least, that there's, this newly found readiness to kind of look at the problem or look at the condition, as is, rather than to tuck it under some proverbial carpet, and that readiness, you would say, is a positive, meaning that's an advancement. It's a good thing.
Yeah, I don't think we're looking for problems. They're coming to us, and it's our responsibility not to ignore them. In some cases, by the way, I often...
Or are we making too many problems when sometimes they're not there?
For sure, you certainly have those that will do that. I'm not sure that's the majority. And I do think sometimes therapy and therapists can make things worse, which is why it's not always the first resort. I do certainly advocate for people getting proper help, but it shouldn't be the reflex. I think there are a lot of things that are going on in the home, for example, particularly when it comes to children, that the parents can work on. And unfortunately, some parents are too quick to send the child out to some sort of professional because the parent themselves don't want to deal with the issue, aren't equipped to deal with the issue, or don't want to put the effort that's required for them to deal with the issue. So they'd rather sort of just, farm it out to someone else, which I think is equally irresponsible.
Yeah. I know of cases, unfortunately, where, the kids are given Ritalin or some other drug rather than working on the boundaries of the home and giving them a stable home. That could save a lot of angst and taking medication. Let me ask you a specific question, because I'm very interested to hear about where you find that there is a real tension, even contradiction, or a real red flag in your own experience between the Torah value and between the kind of psychological first assumptions. The example that might come to mind, or that comes to my mind as I speak, is an example of family therapy, where perhaps the average psychologist would say, I'll just get divorced, it's your life and so on, and perhaps from a more Torah perspective or from the community attitude and family attitude, divorce is like a real last resort. What kind of examples have you seen in your own kind of practice or experience?
Right. So just to take a step back, in broad strokes, I'd say that there are two dominant areas where there's a divergence. One is holistically in sort of a sense of morality and objective truth, the creator. That's where there may be a divide. And secondly, certainly in the domain of relationships with Kibbut Av and, Beit Adam Klevera, and just being able to maintain a degree of menschlichkeit, where therapists fail in terms of, the secular ones or the ones that don't embrace the large reality of a creator, is that we need healthy relationships in order to maintain the quality of our own emotional health, particularly those closest to us. And actually, there's a quote by somebody by the name of Dr. William Glazer, who created a therapy called reality therapy. And he writes as follows, I'm just going by a rough paraphrase from memory. He says, "In my 40 years of psychiatric practice, it has become clear to me that the people who are unhappy in life are those who are unable to get along well with those they want to get along well with." So, as you know, I've written extensively on relationships. I wrote a book called Seek Peace and Pursue It. And, because, the foundation of our own emotional health is interwoven with the quality of relationships. So if you go to a therapist and you say, I'm having problems with mom and dad because, dad did this to me or mom did this to me, the therapist may very well say, you know what, write them a letter telling them that you need a break for a year and blah, blah, blah. Unfathomable advice in terms of the damage that it does.
And you would say that in this area, for example, this is an example of an area that Torah Hashkafah can really make a deep contribution to the therapeutic world itself, to the psychological space, as it were.
Well, yeah, I think Torah Hashkafah can make a deep contribution in every area. Here is where you have a pivot where it can too easily divide and separate into nourishkeit advice from a well-intentioned, well-meaning therapist who looks at it very myopically, doesn't look at the larger picture, and even quite frankly taking the Torah values out of the equation, very often irresponsibly advocate for cutting people out of your life with a sledgehammer, and rather than a scalpel, right, which is sometimes required, but you also have to know those nuances. And there are ways, look, many people, there are very few exceptions, that don't have relationships with those people who are very difficult, narcissistic, even sociopathic. And we're not going to put ourselves in harm's way, and the Torah wouldn't advocate that we do either. But how we extricate ourselves, how we navigate that relationship, how we engage in that person makes all the difference.
Mm-hmm. And this would stem, in your opinion, from a general, I guess you could call it individualistic approach that the modern, today modern is postmodern or whatever, academic or orthodoxy approach would adopt a kind of very atomic model of people. That's where yes, that's the kind of dominant value that's at work there.
Right, but in fairness, there are certainly areas of psychology that recognize, certainly in family dynamics, the importance of relationships. I don't mean to suggest that they just look at the individual exclusively, but even those that look at the family model don't take the larger considerations into account, particularly when it comes to parents, particularly when it comes to siblings and children, because those weigh much more profoundly on our emotional health than I think that they fully realize.
Mm-hmm. Right. So if you would be giving, advice to a budding, a guy who's studying in Kollel or somebody who is involved in some area, and he sees that he has a real knack for people, he has a real talent for helping people, he's able to forge deep relationships, and he's able to kind of, give counsel and advice, and he's thinking about entering the field in a professional sense. How would you counsel him to go about? He should, again, the options stem from a 3-month course offered by some Hamish place to become some kind of a therapist, or doing a master's degree, a bachelor's and a master's, and maybe further in an elite institution. Those are the kind of two extremes. So what would you advise him?
Right. So I would especially suggest we do have other options. Torah, for example, has a number of great programs in a proper environment where you can get an amazing education in social work and therapy and psychology and so on. But outside of that, if you know what it is, there are some people who have a very good sense of human nature, and that type of person who goes into and gets a more formal education, whatever it is, I find will often be matzliach. But a person that goes into it just because they think that it's going to be something that they can earn a parnasa in, or other people have told them they'd be great at it, or they just want to figure out why they're so messed up themselves, it's probably not the best motivation. So I would say a lot has to do with your own motivation in terms of why you're going into it, and invest, do some research. But again, Torah has a number of fantastic programs that can give you an amazing education comparable with the best of the best in a proper from environment.
Mm-hmm. And you would recommend, we hear sometimes troubling stories from different institutions, whether it's yeshivas or schools, of people who are responsible or have a responsibility for the well-being of students, or of whether it's yeshiva students or it's students in schools, and are not always equipped to deal with different ailments or different situations. Would you recommend that a person who is acting as, let's say, a mashgiach in the yeshiva or some similar post, do you think it's important for him to get the formal training in order to be aware of different methodologies, at least to be aware of how to diagnose or where to send people? Is that something you would think is required?
No, I don't know of any underworked mashgichim. They are running in 100 directions. So to ask them to run in 101 directions, I don't know how fair that is. Certainly, I think. Short of that, knowing what is outside of your domain is probably a fair thing to ask. And I think many do recognize when something reaches beyond the scope of their own skill set. And,
to recognize the kind of compulsive behavior, that it's not just about chizuk or I don't know what, it's a real issue that needs treatment.
Right, and there is a easier sort of protocol they can follow in terms of working with a boy, and we don't have time to go into the whole system now, but just briefly is a couple of questions you want to ask is, how much is it affecting the quality of this person's life? Or, what are his relationships like? What is his learning like? Is it going down? Or even a boy that's learning very well, suddenly he sees him that, he's there, and he's the first one there and the last one to leave. Not to say that that's not a great thing, but also possibly something to pay attention to. End of the day is, whether it's in therapy or whether it's in the yeshiva, having a great relationship with the person, with the people, will put you in the best vantage point in order to not only see what's going on, but have that person feel comfortable coming to you and also be effective in influencing them. As a matter of fact, I'll share with you an interesting study that looked at all the different psychological disciplines, all the different types of therapies, and they looked to see what factor was most critical in getting somebody well. And the answer was the rapport, the relationship that the therapist has with the patient or client. So fundamentally, having a good relationship, a good rapport, knowing the child, knowing the person, really, again, puts you in the best place to evaluate and also to encourage that person to get the help that they need.
Okay, and let me just, and we'll conclude with this. Again, I'm thank you very much for your time. And let me just conclude with this. Some have argued, some rabbinic figures have argued that the best therapy will come from a deep Torah knowledge, meaning, somebody who has internalized, is a Talmid Chacham to a large degree, and of course he has his head screwed on, that itself will contribute a great deal to his capacity, to his ability to see through the issue, to understand it as well as possible. From what I'm hearing from you, is that it's less about this kind of intellectual, let's say, Talmid Chacham, what I learned from this. It's more about just the relationship with the person. Would that be right, or how would you respond to such an assertion?
So yeah, no, I probably didn't do a good job in explaining my thinking. The relationship is very, very important in terms of helping to identify an issue, to have the person feel comfortable coming to you, to be able to encourage that person to get the help they need, or to give the person the help that they need. At the same time, having a well-rounded and grounded Torah knowledge, being a Talmid Chacham, being somebody who's knowledgeable in the Torah, puts you at an unbelievable advantage and will help you, no doubt, to be able to help the person that comes to you. Doesn't mean that there aren't limitations on what you'll be able to do in that environment, in that setting, and with the time constraints. But I think that it is a very valuable tool, if we can call it that can definitely... An asset.
It's an asset.
Yeah, it's for sure. Yeah.
We need Talmidei Chachamim who are also engaged in therapy per se, or at the very least in trying to help others in getting past the obstacles from a psychological angle of their lives. That for sure. You would agree with that.
Look, yeah, of course. Look, read Avidan Miller, Zatzal. It is as psychologically sound as you can get. And if you're able to even pick up, one of his safers and read it, it can be illuminating. At the same time, there are issues, in much the same way that you could be very knowledgeable about medicine, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to reset someone's arm or give them the medication that they need, or have a CAT scan available to you. Sometimes you need to bring in the resources of a more full army, and but certainly, once again, Reb Miller's work is breathtaking in terms of its insight into human nature.
Dr. Lieberman, thank you very, very much for having given us the time. Much appreciated. And I'm sure many will derive a lot of benefit from the insights.
It is my pleasure. Very, very good to speak with you. And Amir Tashem, our paths will cross again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kol tov. Bye-bye.
So our third and our final guest for today's show is Rabbi Dr. Avidan Milevsky. Dr. Milevsky is a research scientist and a senior lecturer in psychology at Ariel University. He's also a registered psychologist in Beit Shemesh, and he's also the former rabbi of Kesher Israel at Georgetown. So he combines both the rabbinic history and specialization together with his professional career in psychology. Dr. Milevsky has also authored a number of books, mainly on teenagers, adolescents, sibling relationships, and more, and has authored numerous papers, I think more than 100 papers. So, Rabbi Dr. Milevsky, thank you very, very much for being with us. It's a privilege to have somebody so well qualified for our topic to be on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Good. And so let me ask you maybe, to open up with a kind of general question. And that is, how would you define the field of psychology in relation to Torah and to Judaism? Meaning, on the one hand, some would probably tend to define the field of psychology in terms of medicine. It's similar to a, medicinal field, which is kind of neutral in terms of Torah values, while others would say that no, the field of psychology is deeply imbued with certain values. These could be modern values, such as placing the person in the center rather than placing, let's say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the center of things. It could be other values that we study, whether it's in academia or in more broadly cultural values. And then the question is, how would that really square with Torah values? So as a general definition, how would you relate to the relationship between psychology and to Torah?
So I think it's an important question to ask, and I think the fact that the question is being asked and that we are discussing this now is a healthy development in the Torah world, in the Frum community. We are definitely dealing with more and more instances of mental health issues. In our community, there's more of an awareness of the fact that we are experiencing all these psychopathologies that we didn't think exist in our community. We are thankfully having an awareness of the fact that our people, our communities are experiencing depression and anxiety and disturbed eating patterns and personality disorders. Addictions is an issue that we're slowly coming to terms with. Substance abuse, violence in our families, teens at risk, sexual abuse within our community. So these are things that we are slowly gaining an awareness of and acknowledging slowly that it exists in our midst as well. So the fact that we are even asking the question and the fact that we are discussing how does psychotherapeutic intervention square with the Torah values, I think it's the discussion in of itself is a healthy discussion to have, and I hope the discussion really continues. To get to your question, does it really square with Torah values or not? So obviously depends on what type of techniques are used, depends on what psychopathologies or what issues we're dealing with. Unfortunately, a lot of the stigma that we have in the Frum community about psychotherapy is driven by misunderstandings of what psychology is about. It's driven by older theories in psychology that may have been questionable in terms of our Masorah, that we believe are still prevalent in intervention, when in fact the field of psychology has changed dramatically over the past 50 years. It's not only Freud and some of the interesting ideas that he had, but we have thankfully evolved in the field of psychology into a much more research-based modality, much more similar to the medical community. The fact that we know that a lot of the psychopathologies are driven by genetics and biological features. So it really has evolved, at least in terms of the process, and even in terms of the outcome, much more similar to the medical community. So I think some of the issues or some of the concerns that some of our Rabbonim have with psychotherapy or with psychology is driven by misunderstanding and relying on older treatment modalities that are slowly becoming outdated.
Meaning today, a psychologist, you would say, would not necessarily be bound to the older methods, to the methodologies, or even to the values. Just as an example, which I mentioned before, some have accused the general, psychotherapy profession, as it were, of being too much about, for example, helping a person feel good about himself in spite of his shortcomings, rather than, let's say, a more Torah-oriented approach, which would say, no, you have to face your shortcomings and try to overcome them, and don't feel good about them. Guilt, for example, let's say in psychotherapy, people would try to alleviate a person's guilt, while the tshuva process sometimes accentuates the guilt feeling. You should feel guilty and take responsibility or accountability for what you've done. Those kind of tensions you feel today are less than they used to be?
So I think it depends also what modality you're talking about in psychology and what modality you're talking about in Musar, right? So if we talk about psychology, there are modalities that are change-based, right? So we validate a client's problems, but we strive towards change. Those are some modalities. Other modalities are more about accepting the client as they are. So it's not change-based. I don't see that as conflicting with various traditions within the Musar movement, right? You have, I don't know, it's a whole discussion in of itself, or it seems like the Slabodka orientation is the Gadlus Ha'adam and how wonderful we are and how powerful we are. But you have other traditions that are more Kelm-based, that are more about minimizing a person, and I'm a Gornisht, I'm a nothing. So even within the Musar movement, or even within, quote, more broadly, the Torah world, we take different approaches when it comes to Gadlus Ha'adam versus you're a sinner, you're full of chait, and you have to do tshuva. So it's murky, I think, on both fronts, but back to psychology, there definitely is, again, more of an approach towards a change-based modality that's much more scientifically based, and it really mirrors more of the developments that are happening in the medical world as opposed to some of the more traditional, psychodynamic, Freudian-based modalities that some of those theories may, yes, have conflicted with Torah values.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you speak about a scientific approach towards psychology, you mean to say it's based mainly on empirical data and research based on behavioral studies and effectiveness of different methods of treatment rather than value-based methods, meaning the values are kind of pushed aside by the empirical research and studies?
100%. The field of psychology is thankfully heading towards much more of a science-based modality. So it's not necessarily about outcome, right? So you could have, even in the medical community, disagreements about certain treatments. It's more about the process, and psychology really has taken on a process that's much more science-based. So if you have a treatment modality that you believe is effective, you can't sell it at least in respected areas in psychology without testing it first. So there's a scientific method that psychology follows where there's random assignment and the intervention is given to one group and not to another. And then you see the effectiveness of the treatment over time, right? This whole concept of outcomes assessment. Are we assessing outcomes appropriately? Psychology is heading in that direction. Now, it's not completely there, and it also depends on where the treatment is. In the United States versus Israel, it's a little bit different. If it's psychology versus social work. But thankfully, the world of psychology is heading towards a point where you cannot use an intervention modality with a client unless you know that it's effective. Not based on your experience, not based on what some guru told you, not based on some theory, but there's actual scientific evidence, multiple studies that have used this modality, and they actually see that those who experience this intervention produce significant differences in their well-being over time in comparison to those who didn't have it, and it was done again in a scientific way, random assignment, independent variable, dependent variable, all these wonderful things that we study in undergraduate research methods. But that's where the field is going, and thankfully we're heading more and more in that direction. The frum world is a little bit behind on that. So we do rely on not validated intervention modalities or archaic type of modalities that aren't science-based, and that's a problem, again, not just in the frum community in Israel, also in the United States, but it is an issue that we are not focusing on that. Yeah, sorry?
Do you mean from the frum community as in from psychologists and psychotherapists, or the frum community as in all kinds of therapists who aren't necessarily following the lead, the academic lead or the professional lead in this sense?
Right. That's a great discussion in and of itself. There definitely is a trend. You see it a little bit more in Israel, a little bit less in the U.S., but also in the U.S. where there's various kinds of therapists or psychotherapists that practice various techniques. And when you ask them, is there science to back the technique that you're using, they have very, very questionable answers to that. In Israel, it's completely open, right? You have in Israel, in Hebrew, it's called the psychotherapistim. that have all these different modalities, and they take a short course in something, and they're applying it. But even in the United States, you could call yourself a psychotherapist in most states in the United States and use these different interventions, but they're not necessarily scientifically validated. So we have to catch up. The frum community needs to catch up when it comes to when you're going to a therapist, if it's a social worker or if it's a master's level counselor, and even a psychologist who has a Ph.D., to ask them really what modalities do you use? Are they scientifically validated? And hence you're less likely to come across people who are doing things in practice that first don't work, and second, maybe really against Das Torah or against the Torah lifestyle.
Right. Well, one question that would perhaps emerge from what you're saying, and interesting to see how you address this, is you mentioned that the psychology today is going in a direction which tests effectiveness and really demands a certain level of scientific study before you apply a certain technique or methodology on a given patient. But the question would be, would the word effectiveness be understood differently from a Torah perspective and from a, let's say, secular perspective? I remember Shlomo Valber, in one of his letters that were published posthumously, so he speaks about, I think it was a question of self-confidence. And he says that people, Bachurim, used to come to him and complain that they didn't have enough self-confidence. And he says, he asked these Bachurim, where does it say in the Torah that a person needs to be self-confident? I've only found, the word in Hebrew is bitachon atzmi. So he says, I've only found bitachon in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I haven't seen any sources speak about self-confidence. So just by way of example, the question of effectiveness could be defined quite differently from somebody relying on Torah sources or on the Torah expectation of a person, rather than a therapist, a professional psychologist, who would define effectiveness or efficiency perhaps by different standards.
That's an interesting question. This concept of bitachon atzmi or self-esteem work, and that really has been, at least in the 90s, the objective very often to really enhance self-esteem. It's a valid question in and of itself. But when you're in the trenches, working with clients who have depression, severe depression, they can't get out of bed in the morning, they can't take care of basic personal hygiene. You have people with anxieties who are paralyzed with their anxiety. They can't get going. You have people with disturbed eating patterns or eating disorders who weigh 90 pounds as an adult and they're weeks away from death, or people with suicide ideology. I think in the trenches, when you're dealing with real severe psychopathology, it's pretty clear what the outcome, a positive outcome, would be. These people need to gain their subjective well-being. They need to be able to function. They need to have relationships. So you're right. Maybe when it comes to these more of these detached terms like self-esteem, what exactly is that? Bitachon atzmi, what is that? Right. So these kinds of things are interesting discussions about how does that really match up with the Musar movement, and in terms of again, going back to the Slobodka versus Kelm. But the majority of cases that psychologists deal with are horrific psychopathologies that are debilitating. But several years ago, there was a Ramani yeshiva that came up to me talking about a certain bacher that had clear patterns of obsessive-compulsive disorder. And after getting the consent from parents, I spoke to the mashgiach about this bacher. And the mashgiach said there's no way that this bacher needs any psychotherapy or psychology. Psychology has nothing to offer this bacher. This bacher is a big masmid. So there's no way that there's a problem with this kid. And this kid did not end up coming for treatment, and he ended up having to drop out of yeshiva because his obsessive-compulsive tendencies and disorder really just took over. So we have the solution to these problems. It's not always clear 100%. Psychology doesn't always have the answer. There are people who go to treatment that don't have an effective resolution of their problem. But similarly, you go to a cardiologist or an oncologist, also it's not always effective. But it's not, you're not going to go to a doctor because you heard of someone who went to a doctor and it didn't work out. Psychology is matching up with medicine when it comes to its process and effectiveness, and we have the solution. And when our members of our community are suffering, we need to send them to the people who are trained in dealing with these heart-wrenching conditions.
Right, and And this Ram, as an example, is probably a bit of an extreme example, but I don't think it's so, uncommon among certainly in Israel. I imagine just as a bracket, you would say there's a distinction here between the U.S. Haredi community and the Israeli Haredi world. There's more of a reluctance, more of a suspicion in Israel.
So it's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned that question. We just 2 years ago made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, Baruch Hashem. We lived for many years in the United States. I'm American background, lived in Baltimore. So I definitely
you're a good
have
person
that.
to address this question, right?
Right. So I definitely saw and practiced as a psychologist in the United States in multiple frum communities in Miami and in Baltimore. And now I'm Baruch Hashem living in Eretz Yisrael, and I get to see what's happening here when it comes to mental health. There definitely are differences. I would say there definitely is more of a suspicion here in Eretz Yisrael when it comes to these issues. I think there are many reasons for it. I believe. I think in general, this idea of confronting modernity is something that we've done in the United States years back already. And there's more of an openness to anything that's a bit more modern. So the idea of a yeshiva guy that in the night goes to college to get credits is something that existed in the United States for many years. And Arizona, Baltimore has done it for years already, and many other phenomenal yeshivas across the United States. Whereas the concept of a yeshiva bachar in Eretz Yisrael, in Hebron, taking night courses in a college is almost unheard of. So just in general, there's a process that the United States frum communities have gone through when it comes to confronting some of these new concepts that in Eretz Yisrael that we're a little behind on it. And I think when it comes to mental health, it's similar also. Being aware of the mental health needs of our community. I think in the United States we're more open to it. Again, the United States, I'm saying that very broadly. I'm sure there are many communities in the United States who are just as stuck as some places in Israel. I'm talking about the communities that I'm aware of in the United States, and the same thing in Eretz Yisrael. There are communities that are a bit more open to these changes, but one of it is this confronting modernity.
Hard to equate. I would just, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to comment, these are very different issues, of course. Even let's say a person would feel very strongly and have strong conviction that Limud Kodesh and Limud Chol don't go together, for example, and therefore Yeshiva Bacher shouldn't be studying anything else because that would somehow, flaw or pollute his Torah studies. That doesn't necessarily mean that he can't accept the assumptions of psychology or psychological treatment. These are different issues. I know, for example, of very hardcore communities in Israel, such as in Kiryat Sefer and other, Haredi cities, that they're willing to accept psychologists and they invite them into schools and other institutions, even though they for sure would not accept, a combination of secular studies with Torah studies. So just to point out, these are still very different issues, and one doesn't have to fix all of them in one go.
Sure.
One can...
Right. No, it's an interesting point that you're making, and this parallel between acceptance of psychotherapy and acceptance of other more open-minded processes. That's an interesting study in and of itself. It's a statement that I said without clear scientific data to support that, but that would be an interesting study in and of itself to really go into Kiryat Sefer, to go into Beit Shemesh, to go into Yerushalayim, to go into Bnei Brak, and really look at an opposition towards yeshiva bachar taking college credits. And what their view is when it comes to the stigma about psychopathology. That's an interesting study in and of itself. But
it is interesting.
In general, this concept, right, the great Chassam Sofer line of Chodesh Asur Min HaTorah, right? They apply now in so many different areas. So based on that, I would say that there may be some parallels there, but I see how it needs to be investigated further to really make that kind of statement. Absolutely.
But you would say, though, as a general, again, as a general statement, that such people, such as the Ram that you mentioned before, and other Rabbanim who have, come out fairly strongly against psychologists in general, psychological treatment. Of Moshe Feinstein even has a tshuva where he's not very complimentary about psychology. You would say that's mainly due to what you would define today as kind of residual, a residual objection and animosity based on, let's say, Freudian concepts, the sexuality as being something very central. that for example is an interesting, case in point. The emphasis that I think still lingers in some cases today on sexuality and on the kind of these types of dark relationships that in certain psychological treatments are emphasized. That's something which is of course very hard for from community to accept and to kind of be exposed to.
Right, and that speaks also to your previous question about the differences in the Haredi community in the United States versus in Eretz Yisrael, where you definitely do find Freudian approaches more prevalent in Israel than what I found in the United States. It's just an impression that I'm getting. Even in the secular community in Israel, training facilities that are using Freudian concepts, I find are a bit more popular here than in the United States. So it really speaks to both. There's a generational shift, so that in the previous generation, even in the United States, these Freudian orientations were a bit more prevalent, and hence there's more of a rejection of these things in the previous generation, whereas now it's becoming more academic and more scientific, which is why there's a bit more of an openness to it, and which is why in Eretz Yisrael maybe there's a bit more of a pushback against it, because we really do still find here in Israel more psychodynamic treatments. And yeah, definitely there's some features of Freudian theory that may not line up perfectly with Torah values, but even something like Freudian theory, if you really break it down, very little of it is truly counter to our Masorah, to our tradition, right? There are many, many great articles written about finding Freudian themes in the Gemara, for example. All those Gemaras at the end of Brachos that deal with halaymos, with dreams. You read those last few blot in Brachos, and it sounds like, right, I can't say this, but Freud wrote that stuff in some way, it sounds like. And there are those who have written, there have been books written about how Freud drew from Kabbalah and the Gemara as he wrote his commentary about psychology. So even someone as risque as Freud, once you really start learning his ideas, and not just based on the way Hollywood presents it, but Mamish really going through his Mikairos, you see how he was not that off. And just as a case in point, to even someone like Freud, there's a great book that has been very popular in Israel now, based on this great Rav Shlomo Hoffman. Rav Shlomo Hoffman has like a cult following in Eretz Yisrael. He lived in Beit. He was Raman Kol Torah, right? So I'm sure you're familiar with his work. Maybe some of our listeners in the United States have not heard of him. But I think he passed away about 10 years ago or so. And even though he himself was not academically trained, Rav Shlomo Hoffman, he worked with criminals in Israel. He worked for the state, for the Medina. He worked, and he took a lot of training, and he worked under phenomenal professors. So the amount of training that he did clearly matches up to an academic degree. And I've read his sichos, and I've read his writings, and he really truly understands psychology well. And if you read this most recent sefer, the Sichos of Rav Shlomo Hoffman, it's amazing how Freudian he actually is, right? This idea of of the fact that we're sinners and that we have a Yetzer Hara, and confronting the Yetzer Hara, and how do we react to when we do an Avera. You read his Sichos, and this is a very, very popular sefer. The most Haredi Metaplim use his orientation.
Yeah, very accepted, very accepted.
Right, 100%. And he was extremely Freudian when you read his book. And not only that, but so many Gedolim relied on his advice. Even Rav Shach would send him cases for Tipul. Right, and this is someone who, again, you read his sefer, it's mamash Freudian theory. So even something like what we're scared of the theories of Freud, we see that maybe we don't have to be so scared about it. And again, and this is the most risque of the theories. Then you read the literature on cognitive behavior therapy, for example. This is extremely scientific. I have not found any risque notions behind one of the most popular treatment modalities today, CBT. So again, this fear that we have of psychotherapy and psychology, I believe, is unfounded.
So let me ask you the following question. Today there is a trend, I'm sure in the U.S. Certainly this trend is becoming very visible and more popular in Israel, of Haredi individuals, both women and men, training as psychologists. And I think you could define the importance of this in two different ways. And I'm interested to get your perspective on this. One way would be, and this kind of emerges from what you said before, is that this is important in terms of packaging. Meaning, the theories are there, the theories are true and they're effective and they're tested. However, they need to be packaged in a way that from community would be able to feel comfortable with them. Meaning in the right terminology, they need to be cloaked in the right kind of semantic field. They need to be done in a sensitive way, sensitive to the from person's, things that he might draw back from or draw away from if they're presented in a kind of secular way or in a way which he would consider to be coarse or vulgar, and so on. So that's one way of looking at it. It's a question of packaging. Another way of looking at it, and I'm wondering what you would say about this, is that a frum psychologist, a frum person doing this training would be able to actually make a contribution to the field, or at least to his own treatment and way of working, based on his background as a frum Jew, based on his Torah knowledge, based on his experience as a religious Jew. Do you think both of those things are true, or which one would you emphasize?
I really see it as a two-step process. Right? If you have someone who's dealing with a severe depression, they're not engaging in basic personal hygiene, they're not getting out of bed, people who have severe anxiety, people who have eating disorders, survivors of sexual abuse, right? Talking to them about emunah, or talking to them about things that are integral to what we would hear from the Torah perspective. Again, although chas v'chalila, we're not in any way minimizing that, but we're dealing with people with severe psychopathologies who need something medical to get them out of that point and get them to some kind of functional baseline. And then you follow it up with what we know coming from the Musar movement, or what we know about the importance of a Torah life and halacha that contributes to Drochei Darchei Noam. But the techniques of Drochei Darchei Noam, for someone who's heavily entrenched in severe psychopathology, I don't think the answers really come from the Drochei Darchei Noam model when we're dealing with someone who can't get out of bed, who has severe eating disorder. So once psychology helps an individual emerge from mental illness and they get to some kind of functional baseline, then you tag onto that the beautiful elements of Torah lifestyle of, again, Drochei Darchei Noam. You look at the Mefarshim on Drochei Darchei Noam in terms of the fact that there won't be any michshol. I think that's the way the Mitzudas Dovid explains it. Or the Ralbag speaks about how it should be something that's matok and na'im. I think the Ralbag says it's shalom laguf ve'lanefesh. So for sure, once you get to a baseline and you've emerged from severe psychopathology, then you start applying what you may want to call Torah psychology if you want, and then you're really able to take it to a next level of self-actualizing of Drochei Darchei Noam. But again, someone who's not getting out of bed, they haven't showered for a week, they have no meaningful relationships because they're in a severe clinical depression, they need help.
Or they're doing the Tzilas Yadayim, 100 times before they're.
Exactly. Obsessive compulsive patterns, right? This is definitely not Drochei Darchei Noam. Sometimes every once in a while I'm in shul and you hear a guy next to me saying Shema, like literally 50 times. Like he's trying to get through Shema Yisrael, and it takes him 15 minutes.
We've all
heard Drochei Darchei Noam. This is someone who desperately needs the help of psychology.
All right, so to get it clear though, so you're saying that on that first level, is like a medical, parallel to a medical profession, that somebody with Torah knowledge or with a Torah background or, a great scholar of a Talmud Chacham and so on, doesn't have any advantage in that part. That part, we're all in the same boat, whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or American or Israeli, it doesn't make any difference. That part is basic human functionality. That's like the derech eretz kadma l'Torah. In that we're all in the same boat. in the second level, when we're getting to the question of kiyum mitzvahs, of performing as a religious Jew, then of course there could be distinctions and like you said, different approaches, whether in the Muslim movement or based on older, based on the Torah Shebechsav. I don't know. You can learn Psukim, and some people would prefer to gain their insights from the Torah Shebechsav. And again, different people will have different approaches, but that kicks in the second level. On the base level, we're in the same boat, and there shouldn't be any advantage given here to somebody with a Torah background or not a Torah background. It's the same principles for everybody.
So that's almost accurate, meaning I definitely do see it as a two-level process, and the second level is really kiyum mitzvahs that could get us to dracha darchei noam, but not that there isn't room for Torah or halacha even in the first level. So, and that's common across cultures. The psychotherapy intervention needs to be culturally sensitive. And that is where Torah does play a role, even in what we're calling the first level. When I was in graduate school, we had to take multicultural counseling. So there's an awareness of the fact that if I'm, doing this psychotherapy with someone from the Far East, someone from Japan, having a cultural sensitivity to make sure that I am diagnosing correctly is very important. So I think when we're dealing with a frum Jew that has depression or OCD, is it more effective to go to a frum psychologist who understands the cultural nuances? I would say 100%, and I would think that maybe is partly what Rav Moshe refers to in his tshuva about going to frum psychologists and psychiatrists. Now, some of it was that he wrote this in the 60s and Freudian theory was rampant, but I believe that part of it is, again, just this cultural sensitivity. I have many, many examples of my non-frum, non-Jewish colleagues of mine that I worked with when I worked in the United States who have worked with frum people, and they've had questions that are clearly preventing them from diagnosing correctly because they don't have that sensitivity to what does it mean to be a Torah Jew, right? Just as one example, I had a colleague who came up to me, worked in the same practice that I did when I was working in the United States, and he had a frum client, and in a supervision, kind of peer supervision meeting, he told me this very odd thing that his client said to him, and he was about to diagnose him with some kind of obsessive compulsive patterns, that there are times during the month when his wife is impure and he doesn't even touch her. So would I say that is diagnosable in terms of some kind of obsessive compulsive patterns? So this is a problem, right? Not really understanding the nuance of halacha and how a frum Jew behaves could sometimes prevent a psychologist from diagnosing correctly. So this idea of going to a frum psychologist, I think there's something about it, similar to the way I would suggest an African-American to go to an African-American psychologist that has an appreciation for cultural nuances. And again, there's also the halacha questions, just like in any other profession. Every once in a while, a case comes up in psychotherapy, and you have to make sure, how are you going to approach it? A colleague of mine, a frum colleague of mine, recently told me a story where a client of his had a bridge phobia. He had a phobia of going over a specific bridge where he lived, and he came to therapy in order to deal with that phobia of going over the bridge. And it turns out that the client says to him that the reason he wants to go over the bridge is because he wants to have an extramarital affair in this other city, and helping him going through this bridge is going to allow him to then go ahead and do this. And this frum psychologist had a halacha question over here. Is it a misayel l'dvar avera in some way if you help him deal with the bridge phobia, even though he's doing it to do an avera? I think that's a very good question that in many other professions we also have to deal with. So again, even in this first level of pulling people out of mental illness, there clearly is a desperate need to do it based on halacha, having a rav that you go to and ask shilas about these kinds of things, because these things are gonna come up. Issues of lashon hara, right? Talking in therapy is a lashon hara or not, or secrecy in shidduchim. Also yichud related issues. Dual relationships. You know your client from shul, and so these are very, very important questions that frum psychologists need to have das Torah. So again, there's definitely an important place for halacha and Torah, even in that first level, but that doesn't mean that it negates in any way the importance of going to truly trained psychologists who could help people live a much more fulfilling life.
Rabbi Dr. Milevsky, thank you very much. It's been really instructive, and I wish you very much atzlacha in your continued treatment to help Klal Yisrael with their different ailments, and we should all be zeichet to healthy lives mentally and physically.
Amen. Shkoyach, very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much.